In 1917, Germany believed it was winning the war without winning a single battle. British ships were disappearing faster than they could be replaced. Food stocks were shrinking. Coal was running out. Inside the German Navy, confidence hardened into certainty. The submarine campaign would break Britain before the year was over. When British officials suggested sailing merchant ships together under escort, German officers dismissed the idea outright. Convoys, they said, would only make easier targets. What followed exposed how a simple decision, made too late, began to unravel Germany's deadliest weapon. By the middle of the First World War, the conflict on land had reached a deadlock. Millions of men were trapped in trenches stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland, and every major offensive ended with enormous losses and little territorial gain. At sea, however, Germany saw an opportunity to bypass this stalemate entirely. The British Royal Navy dominated the surface, making a traditional naval confrontation impossible. Submarines offered a way around that problem. They could strike unseen, avoid battleships, and attack Britain where it was most vulnerable. Its dependence on overseas trade. Britain imported the majority of its food, fuel, and raw materials. Merchant ships were the arteries of the empire, and German submarines began cutting them systematically. Most commercial vessels sailed alone, following predictable routes, unarmed and defenseless. For U-boat commanders, the campaign was brutally efficient. A single submarine could sink multiple ships on one patrol and vanish beneath the waves before any response was possible. Month after month, shipping losses climbed. By late 1916, the numbers were no longer alarming. They were catastrophic. Inside the German Navy, this success reinforced a powerful belief. Submarines were not merely effective, they were decisive. Naval planners calculated that if sinkings continued at the current rate, Britain would be forced to negotiate within months. Food shortages would weaken civilian morale. Industrial production would slow. The war would be won without a decisive battle. This confidence shaped how German commanders viewed every proposed countermeasure, especially the idea of convoys. The concept of grouping ships together under escort was not new. It had existed for centuries. But German naval officers regarded it as fundamentally flawed. Concentrating ships, they argued, would simply concentrate targets. A submarine that found a convoy would have more opportunities to attack, not fewer. U-boat commanders believed they could shadow convoys, strike repeatedly, and disappear before escorts could react. To them, convoys looked like a gift. What Germany did not realize was that this confidence was built on a fragile assumption, that merchant ships would continue sailing alone, and that the conditions which had made the U-boat campaign successful would never change. For the moment, those assumptions seemed justified. Britain had not yet adopted convoys on a large scale. Losses continued to rise. From Berlin's perspective, the submarine war was unfolding exactly as planned. By early 1917, the situation Britain faced could no longer be softened by optimism or delayed by debate. Shipping losses reached their peak in the first months of the year, with hundreds of thousands of tons sunk in a matter of weeks. Merchant vessels were being destroyed faster than British shipyards could replace them. Food reserves fell to dangerous levels, and coal shortages began to threaten railways, factories, and power generation. The submarine war was no longer a distant naval problem. It was becoming a national emergency. Despite the growing crisis, resistance to convoys remained strong within the British establishment. Many senior naval officers believed escorts would be stretched too thin to protect large groups of ships. Others feared that concentrating vessels would make submarine attacks more efficient. There was also a deep cultural resistance inside the Royal Navy, which had been built around the dominance of surface fleets, not the protection of slow-moving merchant traffic. For months, these objections delayed decisive action. What finally broke the stalemate was not theory, but desperation. Britain could not afford to wait for a perfect solution. Continuing to send ships out alone guaranteed disaster. In the spring of 1917, the British government authorized the large-scale implementation of escorted convoys across key shipping routes. Merchant ships were grouped together, departure schedules were coordinated, and naval escorts were assigned to protect them throughout the most dangerous stretches of their journeys. The impact was immediate and unexpected. Instead of becoming easier targets, convoys disrupted the very tactics submarines relied upon. U-boats depended on surprise and positioning. Escorts forced submarines to submerge earlier than they wanted, reducing their speed and limiting their ability to maneuver. Once underwater, a submarine could not easily reposition itself to line up repeated attacks. Even when a torpedo struck its target, escorts could respond quickly, forcing the submarine to withdraw before it could exploit the chaos. The numbers began to shift within weeks. While ships sailing alone continued to suffer heavy losses, the vast majority of vessels traveling in convoys reached port safely. Sinkings dropped sharply, even as the total volume of shipping increased. At the same time, U-boat losses began to rise. Submarines were no longer operating in open hunting grounds. They were facing coordinated resistance. For the first time since the beginning of the campaign, the submarine war was no longer moving in Germany's favor. The very solution German planners had dismissed was now undermining their most effective weapon. What had looked like an unstoppable strategy was revealing its limits. Germany struggled to respond to the sudden change at sea. The submarine campaign had been designed for a world in which merchant ships sailed independently, scattered across vast distances, vulnerable and predictable. Convoys shattered that environment. Submarines now faced organized defenses, coordinated escorts, and a battlefield that punished hesitation. Each patrol became riskier, and each attack produced diminishing returns. The problem was not that German submarines had become obsolete overnight. Technically, they remained capable machines, armed with torpedoes and crewed by experienced commanders. The problem was strategic. The convoy system did not need to destroy large numbers of U-boats to succeed. It only needed to reduce their effectiveness. Even a modest drop in sinkings had enormous consequences for Britain's survival. As losses stabilized, reserves could be rebuilt, factories could keep running, civilian morale could recover. German Naval Command had underestimated the cumulative power of organization. Convoys transformed submarine warfare from a game of isolated ambushes into a contest of endurance. Submarines could no longer strike freely and vanish without consequence. Escorts forced them into defensive behavior, limiting their time on the surface and exhausting their crews. Each failed attack consumed fuel, time, and opportunity. Each successful escort response increased the danger of detection and destruction. As 1917 turned into 1918, the balance continued to shift. The British refined their convoy tactics, expanded escort coverage, and improved coordination across routes. Submarine losses increased, while successful attacks declined. The campaign that had once threatened to strangle Britain into submission was losing momentum. Germany had gambled on speed and shock, but convoys introduced patience and persistence into the equation. What made the failure so damaging was that it was avoidable. Germany had not lost the submarine war because its enemies possessed superior weapons. It had lost because its strategy relied on assumptions that no longer held true. Convoys proved that submarines could be contained, not through dramatic battles but through discipline and adaptation. The longer the war continued under these conditions, the clearer the outcome became. By the final year of the war, the outcome of the submarine campaign was no longer in doubt. Britain had survived the most dangerous period of the crisis. Its supply lines, once on the verge of collapse, were functioning again under the protection of convoys. Merchant ships were still being sunk, but no longer at a rate that threatened national survival. The window Germany had opened with its submarine strategy was closing fast. The irony was impossible to ignore. German naval planners had dismissed convoys as naive and ineffective, believing that submarines would exploit concentrated targets with ease. British naval leadership had initially resisted the same idea, fearing it would fail in practice. Yet when convoys were finally implemented at scale, they proved devastatingly effective. No revolutionary weapon was introduced. No decisive naval battle was fought. Organization, coordination, and persistence achieved what firepower alone could not. Germany's mistake was not technological. Its submarines were still dangerous, still capable of sinking ships. The failure was conceptual. German strategy assumed that conditions at sea would remain static, that merchant shipping would always be scattered, and that early success guaranteed long-term victory. Convoys exposed how fragile those assumptions were. Once the environment changed, the submarine campaign lost its strategic edge. By maintaining its supply lines, Britain preserved its ability to fight on. Factories continued producing. Railways kept moving. Civilian morale stabilized. The submarine war, once Germany's most promising path to victory, had become a war of attrition it could not win. The longer the conflict lasted, The more Britain's industrial and organizational strengths outweighed Germany's early advantage. In the end, the submarine war of the First World War was decided not beneath the waves, but in the willingness to adapt. Germany did not lose because its submarines were weak. It lost because it laughed at a solution that required patience rather than power. Convoys did not destroy the U-boats. They made them irrelevant, and that quiet shift helped decide the war. If you found this story interesting, consider subscribing to the channel. This was just one chapter of the hidden wars fought beneath the waves. There are many more stories like this. Real decisions, real mistakes, and real consequences that shaped World War I and World War II. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It helps the channel reach more people who care about this kind of history. And let me know in the comments, which nation should we explore next? And which forgotten submarine story deserves to be told?